let us start the next part of the lecture. Right. Now the talk. Thank you, Sufi Muhammad. Right. Let me come to the questions. Abba Aliyu Yunusa, I found that his views on forms by Plato on the theory expounded systematically. What are your views on that? I've done it. Dalhat Lawan Ibrahim has said, good afternoon. I don't hear anything, and you too, so that's okay. We've all joined. Priyanka, yes. Dalhat, yes. Asi, yes. And Isufi, yes. So I shall now begin. So allow me to set up my PowerPoint, and I will talk to you about Aristotle. All right. I hope you can start seeing the screen now. It's Aristotle. Can you see it? I've just finished Plato, so I am going to start with Aristotle. If at any point of time you can't see any more slides or you cannot hear me, please unmute your mic and inform me, because I am not able to see you when I am running the PowerPoint. It takes up my whole screen. So first of all, we have spoken about literary theory. Now we talk about literary criticism. Who or what is a literary critic? He or she is a person who interprets the worth or quality or type of a piece of literature. And also somebody who brings a particular understanding to the text. So you are exposed to literary criticism through people who are understanding what the text is, what it means in terms of social, political, and cultural statements, not just the written literature. So what a literary critic does is not just discuss how important a literary text is. Rather, what is the intention of the author in writing it? What are the different meanings and ideologies that we can bring to it, which can increase or enhance the meaning? So one of the foremost literary theorists is Aristotle, just as, excuse me, just a minute, I think something's wrong with the mouse. Why am I unable to? Just a minute. Please give me a minute. Something seems to have gone wrong with the mouse. Yes, it's here. So therefore, we come to a literary critic, and then from there we come to Aristotle, a literary theorist. So the next slide should be, and I think it is, on Aristotle. Who is Aristotle? Just as Plato was a disciple of Socrates, Aristotle was a disciple of Plato. He was a philosopher. He was a writer, wrote a number of treatises, and among them the most important is the Poetics. And that is what you must focus on when you are studying for the syllabus and for the examination. So the Poetics deals with the art of poetry. And everything for Aristotle comes under poetry, whether it is tragedy, comedy, satire, or even if it is music. Everything for Aristotle is poetry. Even the epic is a form of poetry. So he says that They imitate. What do? They imitate. And this concept of imitation, or mimesis as he calls it, is explained in his treatises. The third slide talks about poetics. The Poetics contains 26 chapters. In the first 4 chapters and the 25th chapter, he talks in general about poetry. In the 5th chapter, he talks about comedy, epic, and tragedy. In the next 14 chapters, that is from chapter 6 to chapter 14, he talks only about tragedy. After chapter 14, in 15, 16, 17, he talks about poetic diction, then about epic poetry. Then finally, in the last chapter, he compares epic poetry and tragedy. This is the structure or the plan of the Poetics. So, understanding the Poetics, we seem to come to the conclusion that Aristotle was largely considering or concerned with tragedy. Tragedy, which he thinks is the most developed form of poetry. And anything, whether it's poetry or it's comedy or it's epic, cannot be discussed without a discussion of tragedy. It seems to be the most important form of poetry. Then, in the next slide, we have what are his observations on the nature of poetry. And as you understand me speaking about this, you will also understand how he differs from his teacher Plato. Aristotle says the poet is an imitator. So he is actually copying things or thoughts as he conceives them. What he thinks is ideal, what he thinks is perfect, he is imitating them. For example, if he thinks that this is the perfect shape of a landscape, he will describe that in his poetry. Imitation, therefore, is our natural instinct. We take a natural pleasure in imitating. There is another thing that comes naturally to us, and that is harmony and rhythm. We are all born with an instinct to imitate and an instinct for harmony and rhythm. This, he says, manifests itself in music, in rhythm, in beat, cadence. Now, however, unlike Plato, and here, my friends, is the difference, and you must be very careful because one question definitely comes in your examination from classical Western theory. So, unlike Plato, Aristotle does not say that the poet's imitation is removed from reality. No. He says that the poet's imitation reveals universal truth. For example, if you make a comparison between poetry and history, history tells you what has happened. History gives you fact. Poetry creates from that fact. Poetry shows you what may have happened, what the people in that historical event may have experienced, how they may have felt. So, poetry is a transcreation of history or fact, and therefore it is philosophically higher. So, he cancels his teacher Plato's charges, calling poetry utterly useless. He says poetry is an attempt to express universal truth. So that is the first point. The second point. What are the functions of poetry? Aristotle says the function of poetry is always pleasure. Absolutely yes, with Plato, that yes, it is supposed to give you pleasure, but it comes from the instincts, our inborn instincts of imitation and harmony. So we love poetry because it is pleasing to read, to hear, and not to teach. It is desirable if poetry teaches, no doubt. It would be very good if a poem teaches something. But whether or not it teaches, as long as it gives you pleasure, this pleasure has a superior quality. And therefore, the purpose of poetry is to give you pleasure. And it must be valued for giving you pleasure. Thirdly, he says, another function of poetry is to appeal to the emotions. It must elicit feelings from you. Feelings of joy, pleasure, sorrow, agreement, disagreement, and emotions aroused are emotions expelled. And when you expel those emotions, you are cleaning or cleansing yourself, thereby committing catharsis. So, by its emotional appeal, poetry gives us relief. It calms the mind, and instead of being harmful, it makes you healthy. So, here, my friends, you see three main oppositions with Plato. A, it is not twice removed from reality, it is an enhancement of universal reality. Two, its function is to give pleasure, but that pleasure is not harmful. It is aesthetic. Number three, yes, it appeals to the emotions, but those emotions are expelled or relieved when poetry arouses those emotions. For example, he says, tragedy arouses pity and fear. And thus, the mind is calm and the passions are spent once we hear or watch any kind of poetry being performed. I hope you understood this so far. Now, next we come to the observations of tragedy. How is tragedy created? How does tragedy originate? First, please understand that for Aristotle, everything was about poetry. So, tragedy is a form of poetry. Imitation means imitating actions. What are the kinds of actions that poetry can imitate? The noble actions of good men, virtuous men, or the inferior actions of evil men. Tragedy was born from the imitation of an action of a noble type from a good man. And comedy is born from the representation or the imitation of the action from an evil man, inferior action. So while the tragedy resembles the epic, the comedy resembles satire, and Aristotle considers tragedy as superior to the epic because it has all the epic elements, but it is much shorter, tighter, and attention getting. So much for the origin of tragedy. Next, what are the characteristics of tragedy? Please note or copy down the definition very clearly. It will be there in your textbook also. The tragedy is an imitation of an action that is serious, complete, and of certain magnitude. So please remember these features. The action that tragedy imitates or represents is serious, complete, and of a certain magnitude. Magnitude meaning having an importance, having a scope. In a language embellished, should I say decorated? Yes, decorated. With each kind of artistic ornament. Artistic ornament means rhetorical figures. The several kinds being found in separate parts of the play, in the form of action and of narrative, through pity and fear, effecting the proper purgation of these emotions. So, what does Aristotle mean? That the action should have a proper beginning, middle, and end. It should follow a sequence. It should have a unity. It should have reasonable length, not too long or too short. It can be remembered if it is conveyed through story and through drama, and the action separates it from fiction, from a narrative, from a story. The action or the drama takes place through the help of characters, and their speeches and their actions make it very, very interesting. You cannot see the author, you cannot see the dramatist, you can only see the action, and therefore it can be both acted and read. You can read it. So, what then are the constituent parts of a tragedy? The constituent parts of a tragedy are, please note, plot, character, thought, diction, song, and spectacle. Plot, character, thought, diction, song, and spectacle. In Greek, these are called ethos, muthos, dianoia, lexis, melos, and opsis. What do you mean by plot? You mean the events or the incidents, and it should be done in a logical and coherent way. That is, it should be done in the correct order. So, plot is the main part of a tragedy because tragedy shows you men in action and plot is action. So, without action, there cannot be a tragedy. However, there may be a tragedy without character. So, the actions themselves issue from characters. The second, so plot is the action or the sequence of actions. The second is character. What do you mean by character? Character means the quality of the actors who are performing parts, the quality of their roles. How do we know them? What do they do? And their actions must be interlinked or interwoven into the tragedy, into the plot. Then, of course, thought means what the character thinks, what the character feels, what makes him decide to act in a particular way, and how he explains himself in his speeches. His speech can be justifications, emotional reactions, mental progress of or mental perspective of the circumstances. So, character, plot, and thought constitute the poet's objects of imitation in tragedy. To write a tragedy, to create a tragedy, he has to use diction. And diction, as you all know, is speech. So, therefore, diction means what kinds of figures of speech are used, and song is one kind of diction. Finally, what is spectacle? The spectacle is the pageant. How the scene or how the play or how the drama is presented to the audience. Next slide that you should be seeing now is Aristotle's observation on the structure of tragedy. The structure of tragedy means what is the soul of tragedy. And what is the soul of tragedy? It is the plot. So, therefore, what should the plot have? The plot, my friends, should have unity of action. The actions must be connected. The actions together must form an entire whole. The actions should not be displaced or removed. So the actions must be fused together. So the events should concern one hero. There should be a connection between all the actions, and they have to be connected by time and place. Time means the chronological development of the tragedy, and place means the uniformity of the location. Therefore, this whole situation is fused in the plot. The plot has two parts: complication and denouement. If somebody here had said, I know French, then you know that denouement means resolution. So, complication is the tangle of all the intrigues and actions. A knot. Denouement is the resolution. So, complication is the rising action, denouement is the falling action. The next slide. What are the two types of plots? We have the simple plot and the complex plot. Tragedy usually has a complex plot in which there are several puzzling situations. And these are called peripetia and anagnorisis. Peripetia means a reversal, a change of fortune. And anagnorisis means a discovery of the truth, of the intention. For example, the reversal of a situation would be that you have gone to kill an enemy, but you discover that you've killed your friend by mistake. Such a false move, when discovered, is called an anagnorisis. Anagnorisis leads you from ignorance into knowledge. And both these plots or complications have an element of surprise, suspense, and unexpectedness in them, and therefore, a perfect tragedy should have a complex plot. Next, who is the tragic hero? What kind of a person is the tragic hero? The ideal tragic hero is a potentially good man. What do we mean by the word good? We mean virtuous. Somebody who has virtue, who is moralistic, who has good qualities, kindness, sympathy, courage. But he will have one weakness, and that one weakness leads him to his tragedy. So he is not evil. He only makes an error of judgment out of a weakness. And this error of judgment is called hamartia, or the tragic flaw, the tragic mistake. For example, Macbeth has one weakness: ambition. He wants to become the king. So instead of waiting for his turn, he decides to murder Duncan. Hamlet keeps thinking, delaying, unable to take action, and this leads to his downfall. So, the quality which creates a tragedy, that quality in the character of a tragic hero, is not a vice or an evil aspect. It is but a tragic flaw, a hamartia, or an error of judgment. So much about tragedy. Now, what does he say about comedy? He says that comedy is inferior, comedy is low. Comedy started from satire. Satire that started in songs sung to the god of fertility, Dionysus. An epic started from hymns sung to God and famous men. So tragedy represents men as noble, Comedy represents men as ridiculous. And this ridicule of human vice is both undesirable and inferior. However, unlike Plato, Aristotle does not say that comic characters are vicious. He says comic characters are ridiculous. They are not harmful, they are not destructive, but they are ridiculous by some deformity, mental or physical. Again, comedy shows us what can happen. So, a general or individual weakness is displayed in comedy, and comedy thrives on weakness, making fun of people's weaknesses instead of correcting them. What does Aristotle say about the epic? He says it resembles tragedy. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It is a serious action. It has a complication and denouement structure. It can be complex. It expels emotions of pity and fear, but its form, its structure, its appearance is different from tragedy. How is it different? Because it is meant to be either read or recited. You cannot enact an epic. You can either read it or recite it. That's the first difference. The second difference is the tragedy will show you one main event connected to one focal person, the tragic hero. But the epic has numerous events related to numerous people, although it may have one hero. So the epic has a lot of digressions, and they add to its variety and grandeur. Third, the tragedy cannot have a lot of marvelous incidents because you can't have superhuman and supernatural happenings happening on stage very clearly. But the epic can add to the pleasure of the poem by showing you improbable possibilities as probable impossibilities. So the supernatural element is very, very important in the epic, and it appeals to all of us. Tragedy, of course, has a shorter length, and therefore it is more tight, more succinct. Then Aristotle talks about style. He says, when you write something, you must have two qualities. One should be clarity, and the other should be propriety. You must write clearly, and you must write properly. If you are writing an epic, it should be in the epic style. If you are writing tragedy, it should be in the dramatic style. If you are writing poetry, it should be in the poetic style. One must use contemporary words. One must have a dignified aim of writing. So you must also use foreign words, new words, and traditional scholarly words. Metaphors should be used, and a poetic style should have all kinds of rhetorical figures, whether it is compound words, unfamiliar words, words that rhyme, common familiar words that deal with everyday subjects. But there must be metaphors, multiple clauses, ambiguity, and these should be avoided. Words must always be arranged in a sentence style. These are Aristotle's observations. So, friends, so far we've done Aristotle's observation on style, tragedy, comedy, poetry, epic. Now, let us talk about the value of his criticism. Why is Aristotle called the father of literary criticism? because he approaches literature like a scientist. He differentiates between art and morality. He says art is meant to be enjoyed, not to be taught. And there is a difference between politics and poetry. Politics leads to social development. Poetry should be judged by aesthetic development, by aesthetic standards. So, unlike Plato, he does not accuse poetry, he does not judge poetry, he does not even consider the representation of poetry. He says that it can see universal truth, it can give pleasure, it can expel negative emotions. And tragedy, comedy, epic are all poems, and they are all powerful poetry when we consider their effect on the minds and hearts of their audience, their listeners. So, the Poetics of Aristotle deals with the art of poetry and problems of literature. So, I think this has generated more attention than any other work of literature. So I end Aristotle by giving you some references that you can use, by giving you a slide on certain reading material that you can access. With this, I come to the end of this part of my class, and I would welcome questions before we go any further. So if you have any questions, please ask me now. Anyone with any question, you can always type it in the chat box. If you don't want to type it, you can unmute your mic and ask. Al Hassan Salhatu, I suggest you get backup because the class will continue for at least another half an hour. So if only 2% of your battery, I suggest you either put it on charge or you get some kind of backup. We can take a 5-7 minute break as everybody recharges their mobiles and devices, and we can continue. The class will go on for another 40 minutes. So anybody who has any questions, please ask. I can see there are much fewer people. Anybody who hasn't introduced himself but wants to introduce himself, please unmute your mic and tell us a little bit about yourself. So I'm waiting for your questions. Please send me some questions. If you have anything to ask, please ask me. Please remember, Plato and Aristotle is one definite question in your examinations. It's usually a 20-mark question. You need to write at least 8 to 10 pages for a 20-mark question, and I'm talking about an A4 size page. So please make sure that you leave a margin. You divide your answer into paragraphs. You answer the question by giving content instead of giving historical background information about Aristotle and Plato. Your question could be anything. It could be an analysis of Aristotle's views on tragedy. It could be the difference between Aristotle and Plato. So please be a little alert on what is the question, and please make sure that when you write, you give a very good summary of the main text. For example, if you are writing about the poetics, you must give a very, very thorough summary of the poetics. And based on this summary only, will you be able to write your analysis. So, as you write your questions, I will join you in 5 minutes with another PowerPoint to continue. So, I'm taking a 5 minute break, but the meeting is on. Please write any questions that come to your mind about whatever we have covered so far. If you don't have a question, please do give me a feedback. Please silence your microphone. Yarga Bari, I'm telling you repeatedly. Please silence your mic. Yes, thank you. Please be very careful that background noise does not disrupt the class. Thank you very much. Ibrahim, Lawan Ibrahim, I am taking questions. So anybody else who's writing questions, please write the questions. I will address them together. All right. Any more questions? Anybody? Yes, Priyanka, there is a word limit. Yes, Sophie, I'm just coming to your questions. Yes, Mohammed Bello Umaru, you have raised a hand. Please write your question. Please write your question even as I start the next part of the lesson. Please make sure to write your question. Yes, class, I'm giving you the time for the question. Yargabari, we have not done Marxist literature today. You have to wait for Marxist theory to be covered in class before you ask a question. We are just taking questions based on today's lecture. Please pay attention. Okay, everybody, I'm back. So you tell me now your questions. Ibrahim, Lawan, Ibrahim, where are you? Yes. What are the questions that you have been talking about? When did you join this class, Ibrahim? I have been talking about the questions that you need to attempt in your examination. One question definitely comes from Plato or Aristotle. So make sure you do it very well. And please pay a little more attention to the hard work of the teacher in future classes. Next is Isufi Muhammad. A bit of clarification. Do both Aristotle and Plato think that poetry is God giving or intellectual talent? Poetry is definitely divinely inspired. That is the core thought. So it is not God giving, it is God given. Divinely inspired poetry manifests itself through intellectual talent and poetic expression. Priyanka, for a set of questions that equals 20 marks, for literary theory, is there a word limit? Yes, Priyanka, there is a word limit, and that will be given to you in your question paper. You will be asked to answer in so many words. Yar Gabari, what is the rationale behind the Marxist theory in modern literature? So, we will discuss this when we take up Marxist theory in class. That is tomorrow. Mohammed Bello Omaru. What is the main purpose of tragedy according to Aristotle? The main purpose of tragedy according to Aristotle is the effect of catharsis, that is, the purgation of mind of the audience of negative emotions like pity and fear. This was there in the slide in which I spoke about all the features of tragedy, right? So now, in case we are through, I would like to, since all your questions have been answered, I don't believe anybody has any more questions. Do you have any more questions? So let us resume with a second topic, and that is Renaissance literary theory. Literary theory of the Renaissance. In that, the main person is Sir Philip Sidney, and I am going to start another PowerPoint, which I would just request you to pay attention to. And this will wind up the two classes for today. As of now, I have been allotted two more classes. So in those two classes tomorrow, we start from Indian Standard Time, 3 p.m. I will try to finish the portions, important portions of the curriculum. So I'm starting to share my slide. And you should be able to see the first slide, which is Sir Philip Sidney. Are you able to see this? Can somebody give me a yes, please? If you are able to see this. Priyanka, can you respond, please? Yes, thank you. So, Sir Philip Sidney. Thank you, Asya. Thank you, Asufi. Thank you, Ibrahim. I'm getting everybody's messages. Please focus on the PowerPoint. Sir Philip Sidney wrote a work called An Apology for Poetry, or In Defense of Poetry. And he reacts against an attack made on poetry by the critic Stephen Gosson. Stephen Gosson has said that poetry is a waste of time, poetry is a mother of lies, poetry is a nurse of abuse, and Plato had quite correctly criticized poetry and banished it from his ideal world. These are the charges of Stephen Gosson, who was a Puritan critic, and poetry is fully negative as per Stephen Gosson. Sidney says, number one, poetry is the source of knowledge. Poetry is a civilizing force. Poetry teaches you civilization. Poetry gives you knowledge. Poetry can teach and please. So poetry does both. And in early societies, poetry was the main source of education, and the Greek society, which is regarded as the golden society, always looked up to poets. Number two, Sydney says, the poet does not tell lies because the poet never says that I am telling the truth. The poet is always very clear that I am talking about poetic truths, and these are different from rational truths. So, poetic truth is ideal and universal, so poetry cannot be a mother of lies. Third, poetry does not abuse, people abuse poetry. The subjects that abuse are philosophy and history because they describe battles, they describe bloodshed, they describe violence. But poetry talks about beauty, morality, and peace. So poetry cannot be called the mother of abuse. Sydney says that yes, poet did want to banish, Plato did want to banish poems and poets, but Plato's dialogues themselves are poetry. Plato did not even understand that he was writing poetry when he was writing his dialogues. So poetry is a creating force. Poetry teaches and gives pleasure. Poetry is the artist's power to create and to philosophize, says Sidney. So in the next slide, which I think you can see, Sidney talks about the poet's golden world. He says, the poet's golden world, the heroes are either good or bad, and the poet has the power to move, to affect. And poetry can have a variety of forms like the lyric, the elegy, the satire, the comedy, the epic. And the epic is the best form of poetry, he says, because it is inspiring. It inspires people to be heroic, to be courageous, to be patriotic. So how can we call poetry inferior because it is superior to history? So Sidney shows in his work that he holds a very sublime conception of nature. And he thinks that the functions of poetry is that poetry illuminates. It removes ignorance. It is a form of science. Historians and philosophers were the first poets, and supreme works like the dialogues of Plato are actually poetic works. Any poet in Greek society, in Roman society, was regarded as a sage or a prophet. So, no one can deny that poetry both inspires and amuses. It is moving. So, therefore, what is poetry then, according to Sidney? It is an art of imitation, representation, a kind of a speaking picture, and its purpose is to teach and delight. It tries to elevate human life to perfection, and we understand that the poet, more than anybody else, fulfills the role of inspiration. Poetry, therefore, is superior to history and philosophy because history and philosophy use precept and virtue, example, but the poet uses both. He uses both precept and example. He teaches us to be good by showing us what is virtue, what is vice, and he does it through an argument. The historian teaches goodness by showing experience, the philosopher by argument, poetry by both. So the poet, therefore, is the teacher of everything. He gives you delight, he makes you moved to emotion, and he, on the other hand, is always teaching mingled with pleasure. This is not something that the historian or the philosopher can do. So, what exactly does the poet do? The poet tries to persuade the reader to lead a virtuous life. Sidney uses Aristotle as a basis. He says the distinction between the poet and the historian made by Aristotle explains why poetry is more philosophical and valuable than history. The poet deals not with facts, but with his interpretation of facts, with the universal, not what has been, but what can be. So, all works of art, with the principal objects of imitation, follow nature, just as the actors follow the lines. The poet creates another nature better than nature herself. So he creates an imaginary world, a golden world, and therefore a poet can be compared as a creator with the Almighty, with God Himself. How does Sidney defend poetry? He says it is a delightful branch of learning. It does not corrupt the mind of man. It makes man appreciate nature. It makes man appreciate philosophy and history, and it is actually in every subject, there is some kind of poetry. So, when we talk about Sidney's apology of poetry as an epitome of Renaissance criticism, we must understand that he introduces Aristotle into England. Please remember that through this book, he has introduced classical philosophy, classical Greek philosophy into England. He brings Aristotelian influence into England, and he epitomizes the Italian Renaissance, a complete picture of Renaissance criticism, almost like a general theory of poetry. It is a piece of creative literature which is
Hello,
romantic to the core. Yes?
ma. More
R-
information on
Rabe,
this.
Rabe Salisu, will you please mute your mic? I will
Okay.
take questions at the end of my session. Kindly do not interrupt the class. Please mute your mic. I will take your questions. Yeah. So, as I was saying before I was interrupted, we are talking about Philip Sidney and the importance of his apology. First, he challenges the objections against poetry. Then he gives poetry a very, very important place in intellectual and social life. Number three, he vindicates poetry and restores to it dignity. And he assures his own generation of the value of poetry. His style is very simple, very straightforward, very correct and concrete with examples. So, this is an illuminating piece of literary criticism as well as a fine piece of creative literature. So, he gives us an almost complete theory of poetry in a systematic manner, judicial, creative, original, and therefore very, very, very valuable. So please understand that this, and these are some references that you can go through, that these are the various facets of writing. And I'm just shutting down my PowerPoint because the class has almost come to an end. So, from Western classical thought to Renaissance literary theory, I have covered a broad chunk of your syllabus today in almost 4 hours. And I thank you for your time and attention. So, you will have to attempt 5 questions from about 10 questions in your final semester examination. You will have to choose 5 questions. In the next class, I shall share the previous question papers with you to give you an idea of what you have. And you can base your study on these topics. Among the most important topics on which questions can be framed are: number 1, Plato and Aristotle. I'm writing it in the box as I speak. Number 2, Renaissance and Romantic criticism. Number 3, structuralism. Number 4, feminism. And number 5, Marxism. These are among the 5 most important topics. That does not mean that questions cannot come from anywhere else. They can come from anywhere. But if you do these 5 topics very, very thoroughly, then you stand a very good chance of being able to answer the maximum questions in the paper. How long the questions are, what is going to be your internal assessment, assignment, submission, all these details will be given to you later. These are not within my control. So I will not comment on these. You will access the website, the portal, and you will access your emails to understand. So this is the structure. This is going to be the structure of my classes. Since I cannot share the PowerPoint here, I am sending you my email again. You will just send me and I will not be able to give the PowerPoint to those who have not attended my class. So I can only give it to those who have attended my class, who have taken the trouble to attend my class. I will only be sharing the PowerPoint with all these people. If you are interested, please send me an email and give me some time. I will polish, refine the PPT presentations and send it to you in PDF form. Now, if anybody has any questions, we have 5-10 minutes left, so I can take your questions. Please write your questions instead of unmuting your mic. If anybody does not want to write the questions, then please unmute your mic and speak. Yes, anyone? Question? Somebody was asking a question just now. Mohammed Bello Umaru, I think. You were asking me a question. Please ask. Ibrahim Lawan Ibrahim, do you have a question? Abu Bakr Muhammad, do you have a question? Asya Ali? Mohammed Bello Umrao, what is the effect of religion on poetry during the Renaissance period? This is not within your syllabus or within the literary theory, so let us keep religion out of it, please. Let us have no questions, no unnecessary questions on controversies. Please ask me a question that is related to what has been taught in my class. Let us avoid unnecessary controversies. Ibrahim Lawan Ibrahim, I have already summed up everything I have presented today. After every session, I have summed up. At the beginning of every session, I have summed up. At the end of every session, I have summed up. Please pay a little more attention next time. Every slide has been, every PowerPoint has been summarized. And if you want a sum up still, then today I have spoken about Western classical literary theorists, Plato, Aristotle. And then I have finally gone on to speak about Sir Philip Sidney and an apology for poetry, Renaissance criticism. Thank you, Rabi Salisu. You'll have to wait for me to reply because I'm very busy. So all of you can email a hello and that you need the PowerPoints. I will take some time and I will send it across to you. Anyone else? Anything else? Anything related to the subject, to the curriculum, and to the content presented in class. So since you have no more questions, thank you very much for your time and your attention. I will see you again tomorrow at 3 p.m. Indian Standard Time. And that tomorrow, I think, will be my last class because I have been allotted only 2 days to take a class with you. I have asked for a couple of other classes, but in case I do not get those classes, I will be there with you tomorrow again from 3 p.m. IST to 7:30 p.m. IST. To 7 p.m. IST. Rabe Salisu, the lecture is, I'm sure, is more than quite understandable. It is very, very comprehensive, as simple and as comprehensive as it can be. Materials are available on the IGNOU website. I can only send you the PowerPoint for reading in case you are interested. All references can be done by you online as well as on the IGNOU website. Of course, if you have any questions related to the text, that I will take once my class is over completely. So thank you, everybody. I would request you, all of you, to be there on time. Thank you, Mohammed Bello Omaru. I am grateful too. Thank you, Asia Ali, for your very, very kind words. It was really great having such a participatory audience. Once again, you are welcome, Isufi Muhammad. I will take your leave, everybody. Have a good night and a good Saturday. It's Saturday here. So stay well, stay safe, and inshallah, we will meet tomorrow at 3 p.m. Indian Standard Time. Please be on time. Thank you. Thank you, Priyanka. Thank you, Ibrahim. Good night.